That night, lying in a hospital bed in the cardiac unit at St. Michael's in Toronto, Catherine made a decision that had been 37 years in the making. She didn't cry. She thought she would. She'd been the kind of woman who cried at insurance commercials and apologized for it afterward. But lying there with an IV in her left arm and a monitor clipped to her finger, listening to the steady beep of the machine that was keeping track of whether her heart was still doing its job, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time: clarity. The phone call had come at 8:42 in the evening. She knew the time because she'd been staring at the clock on the wall across from her bed, the way you do when there's nothing else to look at and the ceiling has already become an old acquaintance. Her phone buzzed against the plastic tray beside her, and she saw his name, Derek, and she answered it the way she always answered everything that had to do with Derek, automatically, without thinking. "The kitchen's a mess," he said. "No hello, no how are you? I had the guys over for the game and nobody cleaned up. When are you coming home?" She held the phone against her ear and looked at the monitor. Her heart rate didn't spike, it stayed exactly the same. "I'm in the hospital, Derek." "I know that," he said. "I'm asking when you're coming back." Catherine grew up in Oakville, the kind of town where everyone knew your mother's maiden name, and the school you went to said something about who your family was. She was the youngest of three, with two older brothers who got to play hockey on weekends, while she stayed home to help set the table. It wasn't a cruel childhood. That was the thing she'd always struggled to explain to people. Nothing dramatic happened. Nobody hit her. Nobody screamed. She just learned very early that the women in her family put themselves last, and that this was not a sacrifice. It was simply the way things were. She met Derek when she was 24. He was 30, handsome in a broad-shouldered, confident way that she'd confused for steadiness. He had a good job in commercial real estate, and he opened doors for her and remembered how she took her coffee. And when he told her he loved her 3 months into dating, she felt something lock into place inside her, like a tumbler in a lock. They got married 2 years later in a ceremony in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Her dress had short sleeves because it was September and the weather could turn. She looked happy in every photograph. She was happy. She wanted to be very clear about that, even now, all these years later. The beginning was real. Whatever came after didn't erase what the beginning was. What came after was gradual. That's the part that's hardest to explain to people who've never lived it. They imagine a moment, some terrible scene, a slap, a scream, a suitcase thrown down a staircase. But for Catherine, it was quieter than that. It was the way Derek would go silent when she mentioned wanting to go back to finish her education degree. A silence that lasted a day, 2 days, that she learned to interpret as an answer. It was the way he'd sigh when she served something for dinner that wasn't what he'd been thinking about, even though he'd never told her what he'd been thinking about. It was the way, after their daughter Sophie was born, the entire architecture of their household rearranged itself around Derek's schedule, Derek's moods, Derek's needs, and nobody discussed it. It simply happened, the way water finds the lowest point. Sophie was a serious child with a gap between her front teeth and strong opinions about which books were worth finishing and which ones weren't. Catherine loved her in the particular, devouring way that mothers love daughters who remind them of who they used to be. She coached Sophie's soccer team for 4 years, drove her to piano lessons in Mississauga twice a week, sat outside the practice room on a plastic chair reading library books, while Sophie worked through Chopin with the kind of stubbornness that made her teacher alternately frustrated and impressed. Derek came to one recital. He checked his phone twice during the performance. She didn't say anything about it then. She didn't say anything about most things. That was another habit she'd built so slowly she'd stopped noticing it. The careful management of what she said and what she kept inside. The daily editing of herself into a version that didn't make Derek's jaw tighten. The fall she turned 53, Catherine started getting tired in a way that felt different from ordinary tiredness. Not the kind of tired that a good sleep fixed. A heaviness that sat behind her sternum like something had taken up residence there. She mentioned it to her family doctor at her annual physical and was told to watch her stress levels and maybe start taking magnesium. She bought the magnesium. She watched her stress levels. She got no less tired. By November, she was getting short of breath climbing the stairs to their bedroom. By December, she was getting palpitations at random moments, sitting at the kitchen table, standing in the Loblaws checkout line, once, memorably, while she was on hold with Derek's insurance provider, sorting out a billing error that was entirely the insurance company's fault, but that Derek had handed to her to deal with because he was busy. She made another appointment. Different test this time, an ECG. A referral to a cardiologist at St. Michael's named Dr. Okafor, who had reading glasses on a beaded chain around his neck and who spoke to Catherine with a directness she found almost startling. He explained that she had a cardiac arrhythmia that had likely been developing for some time and that they needed to monitor it, possibly intervene, and that he wanted her admitted for observation over the next several days. She called Derek from the cardiologist's office. "How long?" he asked. He said a few days, maybe a week. A pause. "Who's going to handle the contractors?" "They're coming Thursday for the kitchen backsplash." She handled the contractors. She emailed them from the admissions waiting room with her coat still on, giving them the access code for the side door. And the instructions Derek had given her 2 weeks earlier, the ones she'd written down in the small notebook she kept in her purse, because Derek did not like repeating himself. Her room on the 4th floor had a window that looked out over a parking structure. Sophie came the first evening with a reusable bag containing an audiobook Catherine had been meaning to listen to, a good hand cream because hospital air was dry, and 2 slices of spanakopita from the Greek place on Danforth that Catherine had been going to since Sophie was small enough to sit in a high chair. "Dad coming?" Sophie asked, not looking at Catherine when she said it. She was arranging the hand cream and the chapstick on the narrow bedside table, with the focused attention of someone who needed something to do with her hands. "He had a work dinner." Sophie nodded. She sat down in the chair beside the bed and opened the container of spanakopita and handed 1 slice to her mother and kept one for herself, and they ate in the comfortable quiet that had always existed between them, the kind of quiet you can only have with someone you trust completely. "Mom," Sophie said eventually. "Don't," Catherine said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were about to say something." Sophie ate the last corner of her spanakopita. "I was going to ask if you needed anything else." Catherine looked at her daughter, with her father's coloring, and Catherine's way of holding her shoulders, slightly too high when she was worried, and felt something in her chest that had nothing to do with her arrhythmia. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm really fine." She wasn't, but she meant it in the way she'd always meant it, which was, "I'm managing, I'm here, I'm not asking for rescue." It was the most honest thing she knew how to say. Sophie left at 9. Visiting hours ended and the ward quieted down into its nighttime rhythms. The PA system, the occasional squeak of rubber soles in the hallway, the monitoring equipment doing its steady, indifferent work. Catherine lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the backsplash contractors, and whether she'd remembered to tell them about the water shutoff, and then she caught herself thinking about it, and felt something strange move through her. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger, something that had been sitting at the bottom of her for a very long time, and was only now, in the particular quiet of a hospital room, making itself known. The next 2 days passed slowly. Derek texted a few times, once to ask if she knew where the key to the shed was, once to ask what she wanted him to say to her brother Paul, who had apparently called the house to ask about her. She texted back the location of the shed key and a summary of what to tell Paul, and then she put the phone face down on the tray table and watched a documentary about ocean navigation on the small wall-mounted TV with the sound low. Dr. Okafor came by on rounds each morning with 2 residents who stood slightly behind him and took notes. He was pleased with how the monitoring was going. He explained that she might be a candidate for a minor procedure, a cardiac ablation, that could significantly reduce the frequency of the arrhythmia episodes. He wanted her to think about it. She told him she would think about it. After he left, she sat with the word candidate for a while, which was not a word anyone had applied to her in a long time. She'd been a candidate for a lot of things. Once, she'd done 2 years of her education degree at McMaster before she left to marry Derek, who'd gotten a position in Toronto. She'd planned to transfer. She'd planned to finish. For a while, she'd kept the paperwork, the course outlines, the textbook on child developmental psychology that she'd half annotated in blue pen. She wasn't sure when exactly she'd stop planning to go back. It had happened in the same way everything else had happened, not with a decision, with an absence of decision repeated over enough years that it calcified into fact. On the 3rd night, at 8:42 in the evening, Derek called. "The kitchen's a mess. When are you coming home?" She held the phone and looked at the monitor. Her heart rate didn't change. She told him she'd be home when the doctor discharged her. "The guys left a disaster," he said. "There's beer bottles everywhere. It's not like I can ask anyone else to deal with it." "Derek," she said. She stopped. She looked at the parking structure through the window, the sodium lights orange against the November dark. I'm going to have to call you back." She hung up. She didn't call back. She was discharged on the morning of the 5th day. She took a taxi home because Sophie was at work and because she did not call Derek to ask him to come. The house was a century home in East York that they'd bought when Sophie was 3, a red brick semi with a covered porch and a leaded glass panel above the front door that Catherine had loved from the first viewing. She'd spent 15 years making that house into something. The garden she'd put in along the south fence, the kitchen she'd renovated twice, the back porch she'd pressured Derek into extending this summer. Sophie finished her undergraduate degree. She'd loved that house the way you love something you've put your hands into. your actual labor, your particular care. She walked through the front door and stood in the hallway. She could smell the stale beer from the kitchen. She put her bag down on the bench by the door. She looked at the staircase, the living room, the kitchen doorway. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of the bed. She sat there for a long time. Then she picked up her phone and called Sophie. "I need to tell you something," she said when Sophie picked up. "And I need you to just listen for a minute before you say anything." "Okay," Sophie said. Her voice was careful in the way it got when she was trying not to show she was frightened. "I'm leaving your father." A silence. "Okay," Sophie said again. Her voice this time was different. Not frightened. Something that Catherine needed a moment to identify. She recognized it finally as relief. She moved into the guest room that night. She called a lawyer the following week. A woman named Teresa Merrick, whose office was on Bloor Street, and who had the kind of practical warmth that Catherine needed more than sympathy. Teresa went through everything plainly, what Catherine was entitled to, what the process would look like, what to expect. There was more than Catherine had realized. 30 years of a shared life had a weight to it, legally speaking, that Derek had perhaps not considered when he'd called to ask about beer bottles. Derek did not take it quietly. He went through a phase of cold anger, then a phase of bargaining, then a phase of telling mutual friends that Catherine was having some kind of breakdown related to her health scare, which made Catherine feel, paradoxically, quite calm. She'd spent so many years managing his moods that watching him perform them for an audience felt almost instructive. Like finally seeing the mechanism inside a clock. Sophie came over on weekends. They cooked together in the small apartment Catherine had rented on Kingston Road. Nothing fancy, a 2-bedroom on the 2nd floor, with a fire escape off the kitchen window, and a used armchair she'd found on Marketplace that was in almost perfect shades of sage green. Sophie brought wine and they'd sit at the kitchen table and talk the way they hadn't talked since Sophie was in high school, freely, loosely, going sideways into topics and coming back and losing track of time. "You seem different," Sophie said one evening. It was February by then, sleet against the windows, both of them in sweaters. "Different how? Like?" Sophie turned her wine glass. "Less braced." "You know, you always seemed kind of braced." Catherine thought about that. "I was," she said. That spring she contacted the registrar's office at OISA and asked about the process for returning students. There was a process. There were people whose entire job was helping people like her navigate it. She'd half expected to feel foolish, a woman her age, but the advisor she spoke to, a young man named AJ who looked barely older than Sophie, treated it as the most ordinary thing in the world, which she came to understand it was. She enrolled in 2 courses, evening courses, twice a week. She drove herself through spring rain to the building on Bloor with a new notebook in her bag and sat in a room full of people of various ages. Some young, some not, a retired engineer in the seat beside her on the first night who was also completing an interrupted degree and who became, over the semester, a genuinely good friend. She wasn't the best student in the room. She hadn't been a student in almost 30 years, and there was a steep relearning curve, and she found herself reading the same paragraphs twice, 3 times, not because she wasn't capable, but because it had been so long since she'd been asked to hold ideas in her mind for their own sake, rather than in service of someone else's agenda. It came back, slowly, and then less slowly. That autumn she began the practicum component. A grade 3 classroom in Scarborough, 22 8-year-olds, a supervising teacher named Mrs. Famuyide who had 26 years in the classroom and zero tolerance for uncertainty. Catherine was terrified every morning for the first 3 weeks. By the 4th week, she started to find her footing. By the 6th week, she understood, in her body rather than just her mind, that she was good at this. Not adequate. Good. She texted Sophie a picture of a card a student had left on her desk, crayon drawing, a smiling figure with wild yellow hair that was meant to be Catherine, a lopsided heart above it. Sophie texted back, "I knew it." The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in October, 2 years after that night in the hospital. Catherine signed the documents in Teresa's office, and then she and Teresa shook hands, and then Catherine walked out into the October afternoon. The maples on Bloor doing what Ontario maples do in October, which is turned so unreasonably beautiful it makes you a little angry, and stood on the sidewalk and breathed. She called her brother Paul. "Done?" he asked. "Done? How do you feel?" She thought about it. The honest answer was complicated. There was a sadness she'd made her peace with. Not for Derek, exactly, or not only for Derek, but for the years she'd given away without knowing she was giving them away. For the woman she'd been, who deserved more credit than she'd ever given herself for the simple endurance of it. For the 30 years that had happened and couldn't unhappen, which was not the same thing as saying she wished they hadn't. Sophie had come from those years. The house on Bloor that she still sometimes drove past, slowing without intending to, had come from those years. She carried it all with her, the love and the loss of it, and she'd decided that carrying it didn't have to mean being crushed by it. "Okay," she told Paul. "I feel genuinely okay." He laughed a little. Good enough, he said. She finished her degree the following spring. She walked at convocation on a warm June morning, the kind of morning that makes you forget Toronto gets winter, and Sophie was in the stands in a bright yellow jacket that Catherine could pick out immediately from the procession line, which was the point. Sophie knew exactly what she was doing. They went for brunch afterward at a place on Queen Street with outdoor tables, and they ate eggs Benedict and drank sparkling water with lemon, and Sophie made her mother tell the whole story again from the beginning, the way she'd been asking her to tell it since January. From the hospital? Catherine asked. From the phone call, Sophie said. Start from the phone call. So Catherine did. She told it plainly, without embellishment, the way it had happened. The monitor on her finger, the orange lights of the parking structure, his voice asking about the kitchen, and from that moment on, she said, I made a decision. Sophie leaned across the table and put her hand over her mother's. The June morning continued around them, warm and indifferent and entirely beautiful, the way mornings are when you're finally in them all the way. Nothing held back, nothing braced against. Catherine held her daughter's hand and let the sun come in.